I said, what do you think's wrong with the economic system? This was over breakfast, and he said one word. He said overcapacity. Well, the flip side of overcapacity is not enough domestic demand. I mean, if you've got too much capacity, it means you're not able to sell at the domestic level. And the point is that, that's one of the reasons that Clinton began this enormous activity to open the trade regimes to China and so forth. And now trade brings its own problems, which is not really the focus of this discussion today. Let me remind you, it's very interesting that I think a small number of people come to this particular discussion. And I will not take it personally. I don't think it's because I'm talking. I think it's because, honest to God, that's not what people are concerned about when it comes to sustainability. They're concerned about environmental sustainability. And very few are actually concerned with the issue of employment in people. I mean, it isn't the cachet that other issues have. And that's a problem, since I think it's the most important political problem, with constraining government actions in the environmental area. So let's remind ourselves why work is important. There are the economic reasons, because it is a factor of production. It's one of the factor endowments that nature has, that a nation has. It is combined with physical and natural capital to produce goods. It'll labor, energy, and people. That's how we provide goods and services. It's a place where comparative advantage, labor skills, and capital function are exchanged. It's a margin for engaging in the society. And a nation with a large amount of employment has a lot of social unrest. It is a place which provides an important social environment and a mechanism for enhancing self-esteem. At least you would hope a job does that. There are some demeaning jobs that don't do that, but you meet somebody at a cocktail party, find out what their name is, where they're from. And the third question is inevitably, what do you do? Because we identify with what we do. And so, we want to talk about the importance of social elements in sustainability. Workplace is enormously important. There's some of us who are crazy. We don't want a shorter work week. I mean, we work as much as we can. The separation between home time and work time is erased thanks to the computer, right? I mean, I work more than 40 hours a week, and a lot of people are excited by what they do. Some people are not. But then I would say that's because we haven't organized the society in a way where work is engaging. And then finally, the recognition that you cannot design alone workplace and employment changes without integrating them with industrial and economic policy, environmental policy, and trade as well. In other words, everything that was on the triangle is connected to everything else. There is a big mistake trying to solve, the economic crisis that we have separately from the employment crisis, separately from the environmental crisis. I mean, this balkanized and fractionized approach to public policy is one of the systemic failures of the modern state. And they all have their constituents who are saying, no, we want better environment, no, we want better jobs, no, we want better economic justice. And we've not connected the dots. And that's a major problem. Now, very important to deal with this word productivity, along with GDP, which is what Vandenberg calls the greatest informational fraud imparted on the economic system. And we know that, right now, GDP is terrific because we're removing snow. So the more disasters we have and the more snow removal, the greater GDP. The more disease we have, the greater GDP. I don't think we would want to recommend more of those activities in order to increase GDP, although some people might profit from the activity. But we haven't been able to implement the ranking of nations, the ranking of firms, or even feeling good about our own portfolio if it doesn't grow. We are obsessed with growth. If my portfolio hasn't grown, every Sunday when I look at it, I have to have 2 cups of coffee because I just don't feel right. We're going to grow, right? So there's an obsession with this issue of growth because we are conditioned to accept it. Even though we know the growth statistics are right. Well, the second statistic, which is an enormous, and I would say deliberate distortion of the economic system, is this term productivity. And productivity is very distinct from the word productiveness, but these are used synonymously and I'll make the distinction because I'm going to make a very important point. First of all, the definition of labor productivity is that it's the output, total output that an enterprise or a service presents, divided by some unit of labor, either the hours worked or the numbers of workers. Those are not the same, of course. And when we talk about sharing work, we need to make a distinction between number of workers and hours worked. It is not, I underscore not, the cost of labor, right? I mean, we know that if you can force workers to work at half the wage, and by the way, it's interesting that the United Auto Workers have negotiated new contracts. The existing workers are going to make their wage, but any new workers hired are going to make half the hourly wage. Well, that's terrific, right? I mean, you're condemning the next era of auto workers to half the wage, and that's what they negotiated. If you join that union, that's what you're going to get, that's what you're in for. But people say, well, if I can cut the labor costs, I can improve productivity. And the answer is, it depends. And then, you may decrease your labor costs, you may or may not increase productivity. But productivity is a ratio. Productivity does no work. Machines do work, people do work, and energy does work. Productivity does no work. It is a sleight of hand that is used to justify changes which are otherwise deeper. And what are those changes? How would you increase labor productivity? And by the way, you distinguish it from capital productivity, where you divide the output by one of the factors of production, capital, or the productivity of energy. But productiveness is a much more fundamental issue. So how do you increase productivity, labor productivity? First, you can increase worker skills. You don't change the technology at all, but you make workers smarter and more clever, and that ends up in increasing the productiveness of labor. People are able to do things better, faster, with less error. And what happens if you increase labor productiveness? Labor content and rewards to workers are increased. Workers can produce more widgets per hour because they are more clever or they make less mistakes. Then you can increase the output, right? But the labor is the factor that was enhanced in the productiveness of the enterprise. And if they're more productive, they can claim greater percentage of the pie. You want to ask a question?
I don't understand why productivity is not what you're saying. Why they're just so you make.
Well, one's a ratio,
yeah,
and one is an inherent quality. To be productive is to produce, to generate something.
So if people are more productive because they're able to produce more, then the output would grow, even though the units of labor would be the same. So the productivity would grow.
That's right, and that's one of the ways to increase productivity.
Giving them more, making those better workers, more skillful.
That's right. No one's denying that more clever workers, better training, better motivation, less tiredness, whatever you want, will increase both productiveness and productivity. Mm-hmm. But there are other ways to increase productivity, right? And that's what I want to get to. You can just leave the workers the same with the existing skills that they have. You give them better hardware, software, and manufacturing systems, right? And so, who ends up doing the work? It's the capital that ends up doing the work, not the workers. You take someone who used to dig coal out of a mine with his hands, he can produce, or that workers can produce a certain number of tons of coal. When the manager of the mine buys a jackass, the worker can load the coal on the jackass. Who's doing the work? I don't care how you calculate it. It looks like labor productivity went up because output per unit worker increased. Labor productiveness didn't increase, right? In fact, you might argue weaker people and people with less skills could be used because you don't need to be Superman now to put them in a sack to put it on the donkey as opposed to on your back. And you get an automatic digging machine and you make it even, productivity increases even more. But if capital, look, energy, capital, and human labor are the things that constitute what's called the factor endowments in production. If capital's doing more work, what does management say? Workers are much less important to the enterprise. You cannot claim the wage that you used to earn. right? So, because after all, I bought the machine, I bought the donkey. And so, yes.
You seem to be contradicting capital worker complementarity here. It's sort of broadly, and I agree sometimes you have better capital, you'll have fewer workers, and sometimes you have better capital, you have much more workers. They're more important because you need someone, especially someone skilled, to use those.
Yes, that's correct. I'm not ignoring it. I'm just simply saying these are two. I'm not saying you can't do both, right? You have the machine takes more important skills, and in terms of the new job creation in this country, about a third of the new jobs require not only better capital but smarter workers. 2/3, however, will do with less skills.
But isn't it? I guess my impression was that the point of productivity is that for a given hour of my work, I can get more returns.
Who's you?
Me being the worker. So.
Oh, he doesn't get anything.
Is there any claim here? Yeah. Is there a claim here on if I have another factor of production that's more efficient that I still utilize? Are you claiming that workers in general will not get a higher return for utilizing those?
That's what the statistics show. That's why we've had real wage decrease in this country since 1970, and similarly in Europe. That's exactly why, because to put it simply, capital has displaced labor. Now, if you shift it to a computer, you've got to have workers who can use the computer and are intelligent and understand those skills. So I'm not saying you can't do both, right? But I'm just simply separating out the things which are contributing to productiveness. Now, because the labor content, the workers' share of the profits are decreased. Now, what explains the lowering wages in most industrial societies is not only the shift from away from labor content but capital content, but also the offshoring of contributions. Offshoring is now a significant depressor of wages. We'll come back to that. Because, by the way, here's something very interesting, right? If a multinational in this country offshores to China, when it calculates the hours of work or the numbers of work, by convention, it does not count the work done abroad. Isn't that interesting? So AT&T, that uses call centers in India, now has very few workers in this country offering the services. Wouldn't you say that was a little bit of a sleight of hand? Right? Now, notice why the salaries of the workers are not good indications of productivity. Because the Indian workers and the American workers make very different money. So what you're interested in is what is the production of the Indian worker compared to the American worker. And I'm going to come back to talk about why there's reshoring. Yeah.
And why is that the interesting thing to be interested in? Why is that the interesting thing to be concerned about, is how productive each worker is? Why do we care about that?
Well, because it affects who is left to make money to purchase things. And there's an equity issue. That's right. Now, there's another way you must have noticed to increase the productivity of a good or service. You can externalize the cost of manufacturing and the consumers onto the consumer. You must have noticed IKEA can sell you a bookcase and you put 4 hours of your own labor, right? To construct it, at least for the first one. 20 minutes for the second bookcase, but the learning curve, right, is there on the first one. Tech support, banking, travel, check your own groceries out. You know, Stop and Shop can claim to have greater labor productivity, because guess who's doing the work? This is not a silly thing. It's very important, because people selling technological change and changes of employment on the basis of productivity increasing. But not all sources of productivity inure to the benefit of the workers. In fact, in the last 10 to 15 years, tremendous economic growth without changes in wages. In fact, decreases in wages. The great concentration of wealth that we are now experiencing in this country and elsewhere is in no small effect due to the fact that we have not only offshored, but we also replaced labor with capital. Now, let me say a word about offshoring. You probably have seen a Time magazine or Economist article that talks about reshoring, that is, things are supposed manufacturing and services are coming back. Why? Well, because Chinese labor is going up 10% per year. So Chinese wages go up, American wages go down, so you begin to equilibrate. Does it make sense to send steel to China and you bring back a refrigerator? Not at the energy cost if you pay the full freight. And this is said by industry. We've replaced so much labor with capital that labor is not a very significant percentage of the total cost. So the reshoring may very well take place, but at a new equilibrium level of very low wages. Reference the U.S. auto workers. I mean, we may be making automobiles in the United States, and Toyota has got an assembly plant in the United States, but look at what the workers are being paid. Now, theoretically, right? For a long time, by the way, in academic circles particularly, it was very unpopular to talk about technological displacement. That doesn't happen. We know that new technology creates more jobs. We know that it creates more jobs. Let's work it through, right? How would you work through the theoretical implications of decreasing labor content? Okay, first, this is the argument that's been given. You lower the cost of goods and services. You can lower the price of a television set by replacing people with robots, right? That decreases the prices of the television set. So you can sell more television sets and increases the demand for television sets. In the original industry, so you can sell more by lowering the price. However you lower the price, you can sell more. I mean, market phenomenon, right? And if you've saturated, let's say, the high definition television market, people will have more disposable income to spend on other things. New industries will be created, reference to the Nintendo game industry, and workers will be hired in an alternative industry because people will have disposable income which they'll spend on something from the industrial savings, unless, of course, they're earning less, in which case they don't have more disposable income. Now, are more workers hired than displaced? From 1945 in this country to 1970, more workers are created by technological change than destroyed. From 1970 onward, across the board, more workers lose their jobs or their salary than are replaced. So, I mean, this is demonstrated market phenomenon. And if you want to be technical about it, it depends on whether growth in production, because it's cheaper to produce a television set, outstrips the growth in capital productiveness. It may require, by the way, if you are getting a large number of unemployed people, you have to have a continual throughput economy with increasing consumption. You have to produce more and more and more stuff, which we've been doing, right, since 1945. And of course, that may have some adverse effects on environmental sustainability. Okay, those are the dynamics of the labor market. And I'm embarrassed to say that you read articles where the term productiveness and productivity are confused, and it is absolutely essential to keep these things separate, as it is. What are the sources of productivity growth? Is it capitalists being more productive? In a few minutes, I'm going to have something to say about energy, because you probably all know now that people are talking about the end of cheap energy. And if energy becomes more expensive, something is going to substitute for energy. It either has to be other capital, which is unlikely, or you can argue workers will be hired back. Yeah.
Is there any commentary or research on job retraining, essentially? I mean, what you're saying is consistent with the idea that there's new technologies coming out, workers don't quite know how to use them, and therefore workers either get lower wages or get fired, when really the crux of the problem is that they can't be retrained.
There are not enough new jobs requiring those skills. 2/3 of the jobs have lower skills, not higher skills.
If you could rank them.
Huh?
I mean, if you could put skills on a ranking. I'm saying if a new technology comes out and you had a job retraining program, would that mitigate it? Is there research saying whether or not that is a plausible counterfactual that would make
New
jobs
jobs which demand greater skills will obviously require a retraining, either in-house retraining or formal retraining. Now, Robert Reich, our Massachusetts former person here, who was the Secretary of Labor, has written a lot on labor. He's a friend of mine, but I think he talks nonsense because he says, okay, I see workers with low skills, they don't make much money. Then I see workers with high skills, they make a lot of money. It's very clear what you have to do. You take the low skilled workers and you create new skilled workers. That's working on the supply side. Is there a demand for that conversion? The answer is no. No. We don't demand enough higher skilled work to make retraining of workers a soluble palliative policy. To answer your question, there's a lot of work. You see, you have to work on the supply side and the demand side. You can't just make people smarter and give them more training. There also has to be an opportunity for that to have a value in the economic system. And if the system has been endemically replacing capital with labor with capital, and you don't need smart people anymore, where's the impetus for training? You double the number of well-trained people for the same number of jobs. What happens to the salary of those well-trained people? Goes down. Double the training of well-trained people. Double the number of lawyers. What's going to happen to the fees that lawyers charge? I mean, I'm embarrassed to tell you that people who've been commenting in this area don't know fundamental labor economics. I mean, it's a shock. And I hate to tell you, but people who understand macroeconomics do not understand labor economics. Labor economics is a very different field than the use of capital and materials and this kind of stuff. I mean, they don't understand, and the proponents, as I'll show you in a few minutes, of the shorter work week, don't understand labor economics. I'm sorry to tell you that. And I'll show you why. Okay. Now, we are facing crisis, aren't we? In employment, consumption, economic growth, and the environment. And one of the questions you can ask: would a shorter work week or greening the economy help us? So, two of the three, right, areas. One is concerned with the environmental aspects of the economy, and the other with better distribution of work time, work sharing, call it what you want. The question is that basically a way to work ourselves out of the crisis? Well, what's the nature of the crisis? It's worth 3-4 minutes actually talking about what does the crisis mean, because we have a perfect storm. Okay? First, the crisis involved 5 fundamental features: finance, wealth concentration, for which there is a crisis, right? Employment, consumption, and production, and environment. You have to understand the interconnections between these things before you start tickling with one of the policies. You can't do that. So, what do we have? Finance. What is the origin of the crisis? Well, it's the reckless provision of credit, too much credit, and the issuance of dubious financial instruments. You know the source of that. And the aftermath is the collapse of the housing and financial markets. There's a reluctance of lenders to lend. The banks are sitting on a lot of cash. They don't want to lend because they don't know where the economy is going. And producers don't want to borrow. They're not interested in the economy. What has become clear in the last decade, it's not the particular value of the stock market or the wage package that's important. It's the volatility of the economy. And if things are highly volatile, you don't make either capital investments or investment in your workforce because you might find them useless. So the great volatility, which by the way, in no small part, has its origin in the financial system, because money that used to be used exclusively for venture capital, R&D, the growth of the economy, now an enormous amount goes to currency speculation and hedge funds. That's why Tobin, the economic Nobel Prize, would argue we ought to tax all financial transactions to cool the system off. Everybody agrees and nobody will do it, right? Because there are a lot of people making a lot of money just simply by currency exchange. If money's being used to do currency speculation, it's not being used for industrial investment. Used to be, if you were a technologist and you said, I got a great idea, but I can't get any venture capital. What that really meant was your idea wasn't all that good. But today, you can have damn good ideas, you can't find the capital. There's a shortage of venture capital because the rate of return and the speed of return is much better. And this is a major systemic problem. I want to remind you that the perfect storm begins with the financial system. It's not a consequence, it's a cause, okay? Now, this affects the concentration of wealth and employment prospects, right? The wealth concentration and employment are both all affected by this. And you probably know, right, that Cyprus yesterday said, hell no, we're not going to let you tax our personal, bank accounts. I mean, forget about it. Forget about it. I mean, this has gotten down to pretty rough politics, okay? Now, the wealth concentration, the financial practices or mispractices increase the concentration of wealth. Political and economic power is also concentrated. You know how concentrated wealth has become. And if you haven't seen this YouTube, Wealth Inequality in America, I would look it up. You'll be shocked to see how much wealth concentration has occurred. More than people have the perception of. I mean, everybody knows, say, oh yeah, we know wealth is concentrated. You would be shocked and surprised to see just how concentration has become. Now, used to be the Henry Fords and the Carnegie Mellons would create factories and industries and contribute to economic growth. That isn't what rich people do with their money anymore. It's not the same system anymore. So forget about that kind of history. We have witnessed periods of large growth and profit-taking with little changes in wages, all right? Wealth concentration leads to the erosion in fair and inclusive market rules. Government capture and intervention occurs on behalf of the few. Exploitation and exclusion of the poor and middle-class people, which has really happened. And manipulation of democratic preferences, right? The erosion of widespread opportunities for ownership and employment, and this affects both employment and the environment. The financial or credit crisis exacerbates the prior, because we were already losing on the wealth concentration front. The prior long-run crisis in increasing high on and underemployment. It's been going on since 1970. Declining skills, wages, and purchasing power on the part of many. This in turn affects consumption. With consumption, you have a decline in purchasing power and easy credit, which is one bubble that we had, giving the illusion of an economic system that could be high producing and high consuming. Further lowers consumer demand, leading to further unemployment. This in turn affects what people are willing to invest and produce. And the firms historically have focused on increasing productivity by replacing labor with physical capital. That wasn't accepted until recently, okay? And it leads to overcapacity, the word that Michael Piora used, which just means unrealized profits and loss of domestic demand. This results in an increasing reliance on trade. If you can't sell it domestically, you want to find purchasers abroad, which explains why Bill Clinton basically encouraged China to join the World Trade Organization. And I'm going to argue, didn't think it through clearly, right? The further shedding of labor, decreasing demand globally, and the end of cheap energy. The end of cheap energy. This increases the reluctance to improve the environment. You think you're going to have global climate change initiatives in this economic climate? Forget it. It decreases profits, which also creates a reluctance to improve the environment. The volatility is a major issue, okay? And there's a reluctance to expand production and hire workers. Industry won't do it because they're not expecting to be able to sell it. And the greater preference for using capital rather than labor, this further affects employment. So you've got a lot of negative feedback loops, okay? The environment means we've suffered from excessive and polluting throughput in energy, too much consumption by part of the society, and too little consumption by other parts of the society. And the shorter work week is motivated by an attempt to decrease the consumption by part of the society. And we're going to work this through. There's pressure to relax or avoid environmental regulation, shifting the costs of the government to the public. This is, in fact, the perfect storm. If you wanted to design the destruction of an economic system, you couldn't do better than to have these policies adopted.
Professor Ashford, I just want to make sure we have time for conversation. So
Yeah, but I do need to get to the...
Yeah, I was thinking another 10 minutes, just so we can open it up.
Fine, we won't go over that. Thank you. So what can be done about the crisis? Well, you can, I'm not going to talk about reforming the financial system or redistributing wealth at this point. I want to consider design as well as people who've been dealing with degrowth and so forth and so on. And the environment. Okay. Well, okay. Let me tell you what will not work. NOT. Lowering taxes on the rich. That's not going to work, and we know that from George Bush's 8 years, okay? Continuing to increase productivity by displacing labor. I mean, industry can argue we're going to become more and more, productivity is going to increase. If everybody sheds labor, who's going to purchase the products and take advantage of the service? I mean, this is like a commons problem. This is a free ride problem, Greening manufacturing and energy leading to green jobs, giving you a triple dividend: better environment, more employment, and decreasing costs. It turns out the data does not support this. What you do have is you end up, and we'll come back to that, you end up shifting the nature of employment and production, but it turns out that dirty jobs are destroyed and clean jobs are created, but it's pretty much a wash. And the salary and wages do not go up. Might be a safer job, yeah.
It's a wash there, but it's a major benefit in the environmental sector.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Right, well, maybe.
Maybe.
Let's see. Let's talk about what spreading the word does, okay? Now what Keynesian spending that Krugman suggests will not be a long-term solution. It would be good as a short-term solution. We should do it. We should paint the bridges. We should repair the potholes. But just like creating cable installers and programmers, once you've got the programs and you've got the cable, what these people do, it's not a long-term. By the way, I think Krugman and Stiglitz are the two most intelligent, correct economists in this country. Now, there are others whose names are less known. But forget about Summers and forget about these other people. They don't know what they're talking about. They're dead wrong. They're dead wrong. And by the way, the Europeans appreciate that more than the Americans do. Adopting austerity measures like those imposed on Greece, in which the Cypriots rejected, say, you've got to be joking. You're going to tax my deposits 10% to bail yourself out of this mess? I don't think so, right? So what are the additional systematic contributions to unemployment aside from these issues? Well, technological displacement features, and by the way, it is not a mismatch of skills supplied and skills demanded. That's not the problem, okay? What's involved in greening the economy, right? Something we all want. Well, dematerializing, detoxifying, de-energizing, right? Will give you moderate supply side changes. By the way, very important paper by Ulrich Hoffman from the UN showing that no matter what the northern countries do to tighten their belt, they cannot offset the China and India growth in use and consumption. You can't do it. There's too much growth. And we're not telling those nations not to grow. But if you think that tightening our belt, which I think we should do for a lot of reasons, is going to solve the global climate change, you have to look at the numbers. The numbers do not justify it. It's a wishful thinking, okay? Moving to less environmentally damaged energy sources, good idea. I won't say these aren't good ideas. If either one of those things is less expensive, then you will lead to more consumption, right? And perhaps more environmental damage. And you know about the rebound effect. How big it is, we don't know. But lower the price of fuel, you get more miles driven. I mean, this is the increasing. People have a certain amount of disposable income they want to dispose of, right? Okay. If either is more expensive rather than less expensive, you lower production and consumption, offset, however, by shifts to more labor-intensive production, more employment, and more consumption. So if it's expensive to go green, you're going to end up with less labor and more labor and more consumption. Okay. Creating manufacturing energy give you green jobs, a triple dividend. The jobs are likely to be redistributed between sectors with no net gain of employment, and a lowering of skills may be demanded. All of the studies, whether it's motivated by making the society less toxic or more global climate change mitigating, doesn't end up in creating significantly new jobs. Why? Because whenever industry has the opportunity to modernize, it sheds labor. Does it have to do that? No. But the president is pushing in that direction. Now, what does greening the economy mean? It means, okay, consuming less, degrowing, traveling less, working less with lower wages. And the political acceptability of that remains to be seen. Okay. What are the effects of a shorter work week, which is promoted by Juliet Shore, for example? Well, the rationale is the number of people working and earning would increase initially, because you've got everybody, let's say, working 20 hours, and so you have to hire more workers. The workers who have been working long hours have less stress, fatigue, needing more leisure time, more time with family, more time to nurture relationships, learn languages, and the violins go on. They also may end up consuming a lot in their leisure time. You don't know. You don't know if they're going to buy a snowmobile, right? Rather than learn Chinese, right? If take-home wages were reduced, the existing workers would save less, which means there's less money by industry to borrow to invest in more technology, and buy less material and energy-intensive goods, and make less use of services. These effects, plus less savings, would lead to less consumption, and that's the motivation. The reason for going to a shorter work is decrease the pressure on the environment. It's not because they want workers to have more leisure. That's a post hoc rationalization, okay? But the wages and the purchasing power will most likely be reduced. More purchases would be spent on leisure by existing workers. Newly hired workers would increase purchases and result in more environmental damage. And I think there should be a nod in there. More producers would be spent on leisure, yeah, by existing workers. We don't know how much. But the newly hired workers are going to end up creating more consumption. Now, you may want that because they don't have enough of the essential goods. Have a man who's working, high-paid worker, has 3 cars, a Lamborghini to drive around with his cap, and a minivan to take his kids to the Cape, and then there's a car to drive to work. He can't drive all 3 cars at the same time, cars driven. I mean, the idea that you're going to make more work and ignores the fact that the propensity to consume increases with decreasing welfare. The less salary, the lower the earning power of people, or the fact that they've now generated new workers, the more is going to be consumed. So the whole motivation of a shorter work week, actually we're going to end up creating more consumption. They have not thought this through, okay? If wages, however, were initially retained for a 40-hour week and they work 20, more people could buy more, but producers and service providers may shift away from labor, right? From using labor to more focusing capital and energy, decreasing wages and ultimately consumption. You have to pay workers more than you're paying them now. You will use more capital and labor. This system continues to adjust in terms of costs. So it's not so simple, right? The effects would be not the same in all sectors. Okay. So we've asked the question, what would the impact of adopting a shorter work week and greening the economy be? Seems desirable on its face, but the consequences of their adoption might not be what you expect, and that's what I've shown you. And it suggests that you've got to do these things together. Now, there are other ways to improve the financial position of people and workers. One is do income transfer. Transfer from the wealth. You understand that shortening the work week is a transfer of wealth from existing high-paid workers to never worked or newly worked people. It's not a transfer from the wealthy. It's the transfer from the workers You're not doing a readjustment from capital to labor. You might do that. You might change the tax excess profits, which you did at one time. Provide incentives for hiring labor and those for capital acquisition. You have subsidies to oil production. You have tax situations where you're subsidizing production. Why are we taxing labor by having the people pay unemployment insurance when you know for every $100 in labor, pay $150 to $200 in labor tax? Daley said a long time ago, tax pollution, don't tax labor, right? So we can change that. We can change the way we collect the labor costs by doing it as a function of sales, not per capita worker. And you can do what Germany does, which had a 9% growth when we had a 0.2% growth. You couldn't get rid of the workers. Very strong unions, very high commitment to renewable energy. Look around and see what other people are doing. You could also increase labor's claim on profits from production and services. You could do what MIT and Carnegie Mellon and Stanford don't know how to do. We know how to design jobs out of the economy. Do we know how to design good jobs into the economy? The only reason this isn't happening is because capital owns capital. Capital doesn't own people. We ended slavery. Slavery used to be an owned asset. The more kids that the slaves had, the better. How could you disagree with increasing your factory balance? So there are a lot of other ways which you can improve the environment. You know them, product services. You could change workers into owners by changing the ownership of the society. I won't go into that now. You could tax corporations, which Obama wants to do. And you can educate workers for the future. Now, this is next to the last slide. You know Magritte's painting, it says this is not a pipe because it's a representation of a pipe, right? He said, this is not just a textbook, it's a book I use to teach. Or it's not just a textbook. It's a very deep analysis of these kinds of forces. So let me stop.
Great.
Apologies for going too long.
Yeah.
Any questions?
Let's open it up.
I had a question. So you kind of broke down the work week, or the proposal to have the shorter work week, and why that would not be, well, what it would do, right? So it might be effective in doing some things. It would have other consequences that might be counter.
The lesson was that if you're going to do it, you've got to have other policies in place as well.
Okay.
In fact, George Collis and I have just written a paper where we talk about the 4-day work week, not the 20-hour work week. We argue for Europe, this could very well work, but you have to put other things in play.
Right.
Because the sequelae of just decreasing the amount of work time with or without maintaining the wages are complex.
Okay, that makes sense. So the argument is not so much that it's a good or a bad proposal, but it's not a standalone. It's going to kind of solve all of these.
You got the message. You've got to integrate the policies. You can't just come up with, and I've indicated why greening the economy, you may or may not create the jobs, that increase jobs that you think you think is going to increase. Probably not. Probably not. I mean, the really good European studies, by the way, that have looked at this, show no net increase in labor.
When you look at kind of these things, I mean, so you had the one slide where it said kind of the different ingredients of the perfect storm, and it was like finance, and then this, that, the other thing, those kind of 5 things. When you think about some of the underlying kind of ways the economy is set up and the very foundations of the philosophy of why we need to grow and why you get all the factors of production, you invest some money, you make a commodity, you sell it for more money, you pay off your debts, you grow, and you need to keep doing this. I mean, how much hope do you have that the fundamentals of the economy and the kind of foundations of what we think about money and work and these things will change because of this impending climate disaster, or after the disaster has come and lots of people have been severely damaged? I mean, I guess I feel like we need some fundamental change beyond just kind of policies here.
Different countries do things differently. I've indicated already that Germany is very interesting, and so is Norway, a very interesting country to look at. Fortunately, we don't have a one world government that makes one mistake, right? So we can look at examples where things are done more sensibly, right? And try to copy the things that are good and dismiss the things that are bad. If you're asking me what's going to happen in this country, I don't have a very good prospect for it, because wealth concentration has gone beyond the place of reversal. It is just so, I mean, who, by the way, why would any sane person want to balance the budget? The only people who will benefit is the holders of capital, because they're worried about inflation. I mean, for someone who has no savings, why do they care? And by the way, countries have been printing money for decades, and they continue to print. But we're not on the gold standard, we're not even on the silver standard, we're not even on the paper standard. Most of the money supply is credit. It's electronic money. It is not even what we understand as money. And my teacher was Milton Friedman, monetary policy. At that time, when you didn't have credit being such a large percentage of the money supply, monetary policy made sense. It makes no sense now. I mean, Krugman is on record, so is Stiglitz, saying the last thing in the world you want to do today is balance the budget. They try to do it in Greece and try it in Cyprus. There's no room to grow. All you can do is finance the debt. Who benefits from that? The people who have loaned people indiscriminately. These are not poor people. That's why the Cypriots rebel. They're saying, you're taking the money of my hard-earned savings and taxing 10% of it? You've got to be joking. Do you think the wealthy have their money in the banks? No way. This is a class warfare writ large. If you don't realize, if one doesn't realize, the major problem is to reform the financial system. And one of the ways you reform the financial system is to make sure the press doesn't lie. And we may have a press free from government intervention. We do not have a press free from special interests. In Britain, Murdoch's empire is being dissolved. Where's the discussion of Murdoch? No, we let him buy the Los Angeles Times. Ridiculous. Ridiculous. I'll tell you a story and then I'll stop. I went to Greece in 1967 when the junta took over, and the junta had jailed, as all good fascist regimes do, all the editors and all the owners of the radio stations and so forth, right? But they allowed The Economist, Time Magazine, Le Monde, Der Spiegel, Financial Times on their newsstands. So somebody said to them, wait a minute, I mean, you've jailed the domestics, but why are you, all these foreign tabloids are really critical of the regime. And he said, listen, anybody who speaks a foreign language is against this. Let them enjoy their newspapers. And I say to you, enjoy your New York Times and enjoy your Washington Post, because it doesn't mean squat with regard to what people are being told. I mean, how 42% of the people are not sure global warming exists. Why is that? Because we give equal space to unequally meritorious ideas. It's got to stop. And why doesn't it stop? Not because the journalists feel they have to be even-handed. No, it's because the journalists are one-handed. And the editorial policy is to basically keep people confused. Keep people confused. And that's my take on that. And I think it's, I mean, first of all, either political party, when they talk about policies for recovery, are lying to the American people. You cannot have, and you do not want, recovery. Because recovery was a bubble. The fundamentals of the society have so been distorted since about 1970 that if it took 40 years to get to where we were, I think it may take a little bit of time to correct it if the political will is there. But that's the truth. Now, how do things change? If we see an economy that's doing very well and it has strong social support, everybody sold to the Germans, geothermal housing, all these places exist with these great ideas. You might say, you know, I want one of those. We're doing things wrong. Now, whether you all, along with Gus Speth and the people in the New Economics, believe that a social revolution can come from below, I'll leave to discuss. I do believe that local action and regional action can succeed. That is, the New England region could become much more sustainable than the rest of the society. But you've got to have laws in place. And by the way, terrible thing about some of the writing in the New Economics, nobody talks about the government. As if we could really change the government so easily. If you don't understand governmental policies, then you might say, well, you know, they've been ineffective. And because they have been ineffective, or sustainable development did not meet its promise, doesn't mean they couldn't be made effective. First, you have to understand the system, and that's why I wrote the book, because I wanted to impart a deep understanding and to go below the platitudes and the slogans. I mean, I have the same goal as the new economics people, the same degree growth people, sustainability. How you get there is another matter. And if you don't understand how the system works, then you are likely to be promoting silly policies. Just keep you, that's my perspective.
I know this is not an easy question, but how would a region like New England, in the globalized economy, be sustainable?
Well, first of all, you change, taxation is one mechanism, and incentives is another. I mean, you want the right kinds of industries to grow, you want other kinds of industries to disappear. You want to have a labor wage, which is a living wage. You want to have a social safety net so people do not make silly choices. But New England is a fairly integrated economic area. So is California and the Southwest, by the way. It's not the regions of the country which are more or less highly integrated. So you have to basically put things into place which do not create perverse incentives. Even if you didn't know what the best policy was, if you just stopped doing things that are wrong, it would be immensely benefiting. Tax, we tax labor. We put a benefits package on $100 of salary, which amounts to almost $200 of salary. Stop taxing people on that basis. You can do it if you have the vision. And why did I write the book and why did I do this work that took 13 years to do it? Certainly I can tell you not to sell books. And the reason I teach this at Cyprus and in Cambridge, and my colleague teaches it at Virginia Tech, is because we want people to understand. They can make whatever choices they want to make, but don't do it blindsided. Don't do it blindsided. I mean, you have to have a deep understanding so that policies which are recommended by anybody, which are good, you adopt the ones you make a case for rejecting them. I mean, to answer another question another way, the economic health of different regions in this country are dramatically different. I mean,
And environmental health as well.
absolutely. And Airbus, which is now going to open a factory in Alabama, why is it opening up Alabama? Because that state gave them a $12 million cap on liability for airline accidents, the lowest in the nation. They don't want to have to pay. By the way, the new planes, would you want to get into a plane which flies 600 people? I'm not sure I would like to do that.
Can't imagine just getting into it and off of it.
I mean, and by the way, air travel does consume an awful lot of fuel. With Skype and the more sophisticated conferencing mechanisms, you actually don't have to go to meetings in Singapore. You can have an interaction. I mean, it's getting so good that a lot of people are considering, I don't want to do that travel. Not because I want to save the environment, but I don't want the time investment it takes to jet lag and everything else.
Do you see countries in the world that are maybe, I guess part of one of the challenges I find is like thinking about what a healthy economy is.
Right.
And so obviously there's many different measures that many people have invented, and GDP continues to be the most often talked about and kind of widely used. Other people try to measure health and education and other measures of
There's the
well-being.
Human Development Index, there's
Things
the
like
Gini
that.
coefficient.
Do you see countries really paying attention to those and saying we're not really concerned that much if our economy grows in the traditional sense as much as if our people are doing well, 'Cause, I think the need to grow the economy, which obviously is kind of a vague term in
You
some
need
ways.
to grow part of the economy. It's a question of selective growth. You want part of the country, the economy to degrow, and you want part of it to grow. I mean, you won't be able to give people the essential goods and services if you don't grow that part of the economy. But whether you want to continue to not tax high petrol consuming automobiles is, that's a political choice. And there was a time when we did tax luxury goods and excess profits. After the Great Depression, do you know what the top income tax rate was? 96%, Roosevelt. And now we're struggling to get 39, which is pre-Reaganist. I mean, the press and its owners have done such a good job of basically whitewashing us and brainwashing us that we can't actually have a serious debate about these issues. And what passes for debate in this country is pathetic. This view versus that view. There's no cross-examination. I don't know if any of you did visit the UK, but there's a program called Hard Talk, where the interrogator really, whether it's the head of the Palestinians or the head of Israel or the banks, he gets this on his camera if the guy will be willing to appear, and boy, is relentless at digging for the answer. I mean, people never answer the question, do they? And if you ask the questions at a seminar at MIT, they tell you to take it up in the coffee break if it goes more than a minute. There's no confrontation of ideas. No one has to be nasty, but some ideas need to be confronted. And by the way, Juliet Shore will not appear with me on any panel. And I've never argued with her publicly. She knows the weaknesses of her argument. She continues to sell this thing. I mean, and as I say, you're going to see an article by us recommending that we try the 4-day work week, but with other policies in mind. Just going green and shortening the workforce is not going to give it to us. You have to be more thoughtful than that. Have I sobered you up?
No, I'm really depressed now.
Well, no, don't be depressed.
I'm a little depressed because my mind keeps coming back to, well, you need the political will. How do you get political will?
Right.
It has to be demanded by the people. The people
or by
fed.
charismatic leaders, or things have to get so bad that people say we're willing to try something else. I mean, it'd be interesting to watch the Cypriots now. The Cypriots have rejected the bailout. They said, you're not going to squeeze us up against the wall. Now, will the bondholders who have lent this money indiscriminately and want their pound of flesh going to capitulate? Are they going to take more of what they call a haircut? Of course they will. When they pushed the Cypriots as far as they could, and the Greeks should have done that. The Greeks should never have accepted the austerity measures. Neither should the Portuguese or the Spanish. They were bullied by the IMF and the Troika. And they should have stood together and say, this isn't what's going to happen. The people who made the money by encouraging these sales can take a very big haircut. Thank you very much. That's what should have happened. But you put finance as temporary custodians of the government like Prodi, and you get, it's all the same. It's all the same rhetoric, and it's all the same ideas. But things can change. And maybe things have to get really bad. But do I believe that we're going to solve global climate problems before it gets really bad? No, I'm afraid not. I think it's going to get really, really bad. And one thing that's interesting is global climate change is not a global problem. Indonesia and the island nations sink into the sea. We're going to take over Canada. Only 22 million people in Canada. 320 million people here. We'll just take over the Northwest Territories. Just move north, and Florida and Mississippi and Alabama, are all going to sink into the sea. I'm not kidding. Expansion will be north. Northern Europe will be more productive agriculturally. Greece will not exist. So, we have a global problem in the sense that everybody's contribution affects the globe. But the consequences of global climate change are not being felt equally. So, I think we have to get beyond rhetoric. And the first thing we have to do is really understand the problem. And then we can start to be creative first by eliminating those policies which are wrong-headed. We just did that. Stop taxing labor, tax pollution. This is not a new idea. It's not my idea. Herman Daly talked about it 35 years ago. You have to ask the question, why is it not being contemplated? It's such a simple thing. I mean, will people in this country, having been brainwashed, accept an increase of petrol at the pump? I mean, Europe pays twice as much for gasoline than we do. We've been mollycoddled and softened up, you know, and politically distorted so long. We need a new rhetoric. People need to tell the truth. The Republican Party is having a hard time because they don't know what truth to tell. But the Democrats don't have a vision. They don't have a vision. So, I mean, out of depression comes creativity.
Right, I just wonder when you say the we, and we're talking about parties in power not having a vision, who's this we? And how are we going to propagate this?
Well, like, you know, we campaign finance reform, press, proper control of monopoly in press and finance. We need to get the financial system straight because it has such an enormous impact on the political system. So, you know, campaign finance has to proceed. Has to proceed. You know, too big to fail or too big to jail, which is it? You know.
Oh.
Yeah.
I mean, apparently. So and Elizabeth Warren does that, and everyone, all the progressives cheer, and it goes on
Yeah,
Facebook.
she deserves support. I gave her a lot of money.
Yeah, right. That's one way.
I mean, you know,
Yeah.
and she says the right things, and she's she's absolutely right, and she's right in her approach. We need 25 of Elizabeth Warrens in the Senate. And, you know, the problems is that people who are worse affected don't vote. They don't organize. They become depressed and disillusioned. And the powers that be know that they can count on them not going to the polls. So we have to activate the base. In that sense, I agree with the grassroots. But the grassroots have to really have a vision for what's wrong and what needs to be changed. And it needs to be multifaceted. It can't be one slogan. You know, things reduced to one slogan. Shorter work week, green the economy, biofuels, I mean, whatever you want. The one slogan, because of the interconnectedness of the system, isn't it? So comprehensive, integrated policy. You know, people need to have a vision and think, and I wish that Washington had that, but they don't, because it's, whether you're a liberal economist or a conservative economist, you're still an economist. You know, and as Kenneth Boulding once said, anybody who thinks the world is infinite and have infinite resources is either a madman or an economist. Right?
There are a lot of good economists. Thank you, Professor Ashford.
Thank you for the opportunity. I wish more people had come.
Yeah. Well, it's a hard time because it's pretty break. A lot of people have taken off.
Sure.
But there are a lot of people saying they were live streaming it. They were
Really?
asking for the link, yeah. So there are people who just decided to stay in their offices, they have deadlines and stuff. But
Okay.
yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much.
You're welcome.